Welcome, everyone, to the Information's TITV. My name is Akash Pasricha. It is Monday, March 2nd. Today on the show, we are unpacking what we know about Anthropic's plans to sue the government over its supply chain risk designation and OpenAI's deal with the Pentagon. We'll then bring on an OpenAI investor from Khosla Ventures to hear his view on all of this, and also hear a little bit about how he is thinking about the company's roadmap at large. We're then turning to an exclusive story from our Apple reporter published today about how Apple could increasingly turn to Google for cloud support as its own cloud efforts have struggled and it looks once again to outside partners. And finally, we will end the show with a look at how the AI data center buildout has spurred the acceleration of extra high voltage power lines. That is the subject of our AI infrastructure newsletter out today. It's going to be a busy show, so let's get right on into it. Anthropic is readying its court challenge to the government's designation that it is a supply chain risk after the company wouldn't budge on a contract with the Department of Defense. Meanwhile, OpenAI has struck its own agreement with the Pentagon. For more analysis on how both of these dynamics could play out, I want to bring on Erin Woo, who has been covering this story very closely over the past week. Erin, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so I know that a lot has happened over the weekend, and a lot happened in the days leading up to the weekend as well. A lot has happened, okay?
Yeah.
There's a lot going on. Walk us through just the chronology of the past week and then where we sit today with these dynamics.
Yeah. So essentially, we've had a few weeks of escalating negotiations between Anthropic and the Pentagon over essentially what Anthropic will allow the Pentagon to use its AI for. So the Pentagon wants to be able to use AI companies' AI for, quote, all lawful uses. And Anthropic has two red lines: no use of its AI for mass domestic surveillance, and no use of its AI for fully autonomous weapon systems. So, what happened last week after these weeks of negotiations that have spilled out into the public, Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei and Pete Hegseth meet face to face, continuing negotiations. Anthropic, after this, days after this, publishes a statement essentially saying that it's going to hold to these red lines. That on Friday, they have a deadline to essentially either agree to the Anthrop. On Friday,
There,
they have a Sorry.
it's been a long weekend. I thought I know you've been working the phones all weekend. So
Yes.
let me help you with this timeline.
Yeah.
So Friday they have the deadline.
Yes.
5:01 p.m. is when the Department of Defense and Anthropic have to reach a deal. Anthropic has to say whether or not they will budge on these red lines essentially. And then where we sort of left off last week is OpenAI came into the mix. How did they come into the mix?
Yeah. So OpenAI has been negotiating this deal essentially as in parallel as Anthropic has been negotiating its deal. And so at 5:01 p.m. ET, the deal does not come together for Anthropic, and Pete Hegseth declares Anthropic a supply chain risk. Later that night, OpenAI announces that it's signed a similar but different and many important aspects deal with the Pentagon to provide OpenAI's models on classified systems.
Okay, so we have the OpenAI agreement, and now we have the Anthropic supply chain risk designation. I want to get into both of these pieces separately.
Yeah.
Eh, Was OpenAI's agreement with the Pentagon any different than
Yeah.
what Anthropic was sort of fighting against?
Yeah. Yeah, so in many important ways, yes. Anthropic was fighting against this contractual language that said that the Pentagon could use its AI for any lawful uses. OpenAI agreed to this contract language. However, OpenAI says that it negotiated other bits of the agreement that it's hoping will help it keep the exact same red lines with Anthropic, which is prohibitions against the use of its AI for lethal autonomous weapons and mass surveillance. So OpenAI says that because it can keep its safety guardrails in its models, it can use technological means to prevent the Pentagon from doing those things. OpenAI also negotiated its agreement so that it only works in the cloud, not on edge deployed models, which OpenAI says means that it can't be used on lethal autonomous weapons. And finally, OpenAI negotiated the right to have OpenAI engineers, cleared personnel working with the Pentagon to help implement it, which they're hoping will give them more visibility into what's actually going on.
So in other words, OpenAI is saying that, hey, what we may have given up a little bit in terms of language, we actually have those extra guardrails in place on the technology side. And so
Yeah.
we can ensure that we have a little bit of control over what the
Yeah.
technology is being used for.
And just to note, like, we've seen part of the contract, which in fairness is more than we've seen from Anthropic. So OpenAI released a couple paragraphs of contract language over the weekend that deal specifically with the lethal autonomous weapons and mass domestic surveillance clauses. So we've seen two paragraphs of the contract, but we haven't seen the whole thing. And so we don't know how it works with safety guardrails or forward deployed engineers or whatever. And so there's still a lot of unanswered questions.
Okay, now how have people been reacting to this? Because over the weekend, I mean, I've seen people posting screenshots of Anthropic climbing up the leaderboard. I've seen people with very strong reactions both ways
Yeah.
to OpenAI's contract. Just walk us through how people are thinking about these two.
Right. So it's been a huge weekend for sitting on Twitter and watching people post about it. Um, Over the weekend, like Sam Altman and some of his top execs did like an ask me anything on Twitter. So huge weekend for people posting. I mean, overall, there's a moment when the deal was first announced, there was a moment when people were like, oh my God, like how did OpenAI get the exact same deal that Anthropic failed to get? But over the weekend, that sentiment really swung towards OpenAI seems to have accepted something that Anthropic had concerns about. And so that raises a lot of questions about, for example, how OpenAI employees feel about this. As of last night, around 100 of them had signed this pledge, co-organized with Google around standing in solidarity with Anthropic. And so OpenAI employees, especially researchers, are in this incredibly hot talent market. We all remember like the AI talent wars from last summer. And so if OpenAI employees decide to kind of try to speak out against this, there could be some real impact there. On the other hand, we don't totally know like how this contract works. And OpenAI has said that it kept the same red lines as Anthropic, and so it's possible that OpenAI employees are like happy with this contract.
Now, what about the Anthropic lawsuit? I know that I think, as far as we know, Anthropic has released a statement. They said we plan to challenge this designation
Yeah.
in court.
Yep.
So we don't know a lot, but I
Right.
wonder if you've talked to any lawyers or any experts around what sort of legal argument they might use and how much of a chance you think they have to
Yeah.
overturn this designation.
Right. So essentially, what Pete Hegseth has done is declare Anthropic a supply chain risk. And in his tweet on Friday, he used a really expansive definition of supply chain risk. And so what he wrote was that he was barring Anthropic from having any commercial relationship with anyone who does business with the Pentagon, which is so many companies. For example, Anthropic's cloud providers, Amazon and Google, are both military contractors. And so theoretically, this could cut Anthropic off from not even just being able to sell to customers, but being able to like receive cloud services. And so this is a really big deal if courts uphold it, as Pete Hegseth has talked about. But I think the question is, would courts uphold it? My colleague Rocket talked to some lawyers on Friday. This idea is that this is a law that was designed for foreign companies. Like it's not designed to be applied to an American company. So there's that. Dario, the CEO of Anthropic, is also arguing that it would only ban Anthropic from being used much more narrowly in the military supply chain. So there's that argument secondarily. However, there's also the point that courts may be more likely to defer to the federal government on matters of national security. That was also a point that came up in the TikTok ban, if you remember that. Um, and for in practicality, like companies who are dealing with Anthropic may just find it easier and safer to cut ties.
Hmm. Last question for you, Erin. I mean, you mentioned the TikTok ban. You have covered social media extensively.
Yes.
Now you're covering the way that AI companies are interacting with the government.
Yeah.
Do you see any similarities, differences, in terms of how this is all playing out? I mean, this is these are issues that have spanned multiple administrations,
Yeah.
right? And so I just wonder, how you're thinking about, is this a story that we've seen before? The supply chain risk is obviously something new, but
Yeah.
can we learn anything from past Silicon Valley brush ups with the government? I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is new in a lot of ways, and there's also like a lot of history that comes into it. So, I mean, like if you look at tech companies working with the military, there's obviously like a rich history of that happening and also employees protesting it. So, most famously, you have Project Maven in 2018. Like Google declined to renew its contract three. After 3,000 or thousands of Google employees signed an open letter opposing it. So there's history of tech companies working with the military and companies' response to that. Obviously, in a lot of ways with AI, we're in very uncharted territory. And look, when you're asking that question, what I was thinking, I was talking to a lawyer yesterday about these two questions of lethal autonomous weapons and mass surveillance. And I was asking, like, oh, like, what can AI do with that? And what this person was really hammering home for me was that like Congress needs to act. Like, and in that way, we're in like a very similar situation to social media where we really don't have any meaningful regulation of social media on a national level, despite these services being around for years and years. So I think if anything, like one of the real parallels that we have is just tech companies being so far ahead of Congress in terms of regulation that we're now in this gray area where like, yeah, like private companies are trying to decide like what should be acceptable for this kind of technology.
Great. Well, Erin, I want to thank you for coming on. That is Erin Woo, our reporter here at The Information. For more coverage on OpenAI's agreement with the Department of Defense, I want to bring on Ethan Choi, who focuses on growth stage investing at Khosla Ventures. Khosla, of course, is an early investor in OpenAI. Ethan, welcome to TITV. It's great to have you here.
Great to have you here. Thanks so much for having me.
So, you work with OpenAI as an investor. What is your view of the agreement with the Department of Defense and how things have played out?
Look, this isn't really, these two companies obviously have been battling it out on the model front, and this really isn't about the model this time. It's really about contract language, and the fight, here is mostly about one phrase actually, which is the phrase of all lawful purposes, and ultimately comes down to the values and the philosophies of both companies, and you're seeing that play out in real time.
Okay. And so, do you see people are concerned that OpenAI has said that they're okay with that phrase, and they're saying that they have other guardrails to sort of, protect against uses that they don't approve of. I mean, do you understand the concern from people? Walk us through how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, look, Sam did an AMA and he broke it down really well, which is, at the heart of this whole debate is one meta question, and one maybe that's more important than the red lines, which I can get into. The meta question is, does a private company, even as important as Anthropic or OpenAI, do they have more power to decide how the government operates than democratically elected officials and the government? And I think that's the heart of the matter here, because ultimately we have a government that has a Department of War that is has the responsibility and the context and the people and the expertise to interact with the technology to fulfill its purposes. And Sam has ultimately decided that it's not up to OpenAI as a company and their leadership to determine how to use that. And I think that's the right point of view. I don't think there should be a single company, private company, that can control what the government specifically does when it comes to matters of national defense.
Let me ask you about this supply chain risk designation. As an investor who's investing in the AI sector at large, and we'll step outside of the OpenAI sandbox for just a minute. I mean, does that designation or the idea that the government may grant or label a company with that designation, does that cast any kind of a chill for you over investing in AI, or does it add any kind of a risk for you as an investor?
Not on the broader spectrum of things. It is unprecedented, just to be clear, that the government is looking at applying that kind of designation to a private company. With that said, I would imagine in defense tech that if there are situations where a company decides to not um, to be not to provide the technology or the capabilities that the government needs to fulfill its responsibilities and activities, then it seems fair that the government has some repercussions and abilities and teeth to enforce the rights that they have, which is as a government and using a specific vendor, they have the right to protect our nation's citizens. So I can understand it to a large degree, but I also understand the concerns that others may have, where if the government becomes very heavy-handed in that manner, then what rights do we have as citizens to protect ourselves?
And one more question for you on this note here. I am curious around the differences in the technical capabilities between OpenAI and Anthropic. I mean, is it your understanding that there is a difference in how much control OpenAI has over its technology compared to Anthropic? I'm sort of trying to understand the argument here that the the technology guardrails could really uphold the risk against the language, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. So maybe coming back to my first point, where this is actually a battle between contract language and not actually the models. If you look at the difference between OpenAI and Anthropic, there are small differences in the actual deployment of the technology. OpenAI largely has focused on enabling its application in the cloud. Uh, Anthropic through Claude Code and their plugins actually is tied deeply into existing applications that we use every day, things like Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel. And there's a slight difference in that deployment, but it's again back to the contract language. And what's happened here is Anthropic has decided that they want um, very, very bright red lines and enforceable contracts to try and control and narrow the permissions up front. And what OpenAI has decided to do is actually live under the umbrella of all lawful purposes, which is basically trusting the government to use the technology lawfully, um, and then control the use of OpenAI actually through the deployment. So there's a few things that they've done, which is it has to be deployed through the cloud and not at the edge. So OpenAI can monitor how it's being used and can actually enforce the red lines. They can actually they've got safety and guardrails that OpenAI controls, which is basically OpenAI can enforce the guardrails directly through the model itself. Third, they have their safety and alignment team deeply embedded inside the deployment of OpenAI's product inside the Department of War. So it's really this matter of Anthropic trying to restrict and get these bright red lines, which there are two things that they really want, which is, no mass surveillance of U.S. citizens, and the second one is no autonomous use of AI in the use of weapons. So those are the things that Anthropic wanted upfront, and the Department of War committing that they don't do those two things. But if you think about war and government, it's always a nuanced thing. There are gray lines that humans need to make the judgments, and the government's basically saying, in the Department of War, saying you need to trust that we are going to do the right things for U.S. citizens and our country. And Sam has ultimately decided that he trusts the U.S. government and the Department of War to do that. I would add that OpenAI also added one more red line that is very important to them, um, and that is no high stakes automated decisions, things like social credit, where, for example, the CCP and Chinese government monitor whether you jaywalk across the street, and that takes you take a hit on your social credit, and that has implications to your ability to borrow money and perform business activities. OpenAI has also added that the U.S. government cannot do that. But I think ultimately, um, I do believe and I admire um, Dario and Anthropic for what they've done, which is take a stand for the values that they actually incorporated the company on. And if you remember, Dario and his team worked at OpenAI, and they were very critical in the launch of ChatGPT and GPT-3, and they spun out of OpenAI because they felt that at the time OpenAI wasn't prioritizing the values of safety, which they cared about, and they've built the company upon the principles of safety. And so there was a real test, and I was Really, really curious to see if Dario actually stood up to the constitution that basically he built the company upon, and massive respect to him and Anthropic for doing that. But I don't think ultimately it's a moral argument, because I think OpenAI um, is going to enable the things that the government needs to do, but have the right type of restrictions in place.
Right. I want to zoom out a little bit. So, this was not the only news that OpenAI made last week. It obviously had the big funding round, and one thing that I was that we were all sort of studying closely was some of the conditions upon which some of the backers, namely Amazon, have underneath the $50 billion investment. There's some conditions. You either have to uh, go public, or you have to basically reach AGI, I think, is sort of the understanding here. And I just want to ask you about the IPO piece of all this. I mean, what is your understanding here of the timeline for OpenAI on an IPO?
Look, I can't comment publicly on that, and I think the company and Sarah Fryer have done a good job just helping people understand the how they think about it. So I'll leave it to them. Um,
And
look,
and maybe, the broader question I have, though, is, as an investor, we've reported extensively on the company's financial projections, and I'm curious how you think about how much the costs of the company is going up, and how you think about their path to profitability at all in this climate where it just seems like, they continue to need more compute.
yeah. I find it funny when others at this point in time, I mean, these companies are not that old, and we're in the biggest technological shift and wave and platform shift, the most important shift that has ever happened. It takes a lot of dollars and money and research to continue to increase the capabilities of the models and the product. On top of that, the inference demands through the roof. And I've said this publicly, but I believe the demand for compute intelligence is infinite. And when you're dealing with a situation where you are redefining how the world gets work done, you are providing cognitive power and intelligence to almost every aspect of our lives. I don't understand why so many people are fixated on both companies being profitable today. Um, if you look at the history of Amazon and Google and others, you will find that I kind of abide by Jeff Bezos's long letters to his investors when he was public, which is we will focus on being long term in our thinking versus being short term focused on profitability. There's so much to be built. There is so much R&D to do, and and we are still figuring out the unit economics of inference. And in that environment, I think it makes sense that both companies raise a lot of money and give themselves cushion to have the capabilities and the team to build a product and deliver that to their customers. I think if we look back in 10 to 20 years, both companies will be massively profitable. uh, the most important companies that we have that are public, and they will be profitable. And we will look back and wonder why some people in year 3 or 4 of OpenAI and AI and Anthropic's history was so fixated on them being profitable. I just don't think it's important today.
Got it. Well, Ethan, I want to thank you for coming on. That is Ethan Choi, a partner at Khosla Ventures here on TITV. Apple's deal in January to use Google's models to power its new and improved upcoming Siri has opened the possibility that Apple could increasingly rely on Google for even more parts of its cloud operations. That is according to a new exclusive report from The Information out today. I want to bring on our Apple reporter, Aaron Tilley, who wrote that piece to share with us what he's found. Aaron, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, great to be back. Thanks for having me.
So, what did you find about Apple's discussions with Google?
Yeah, as you said, in January they signed this Gemini deal to use Google's AI model to power upgraded Siri. A part of that is also a broader sort of cloud arrangement where Apple is now exploring various ways to use more of Google's cloud, and that most importantly includes its AI products. To date, since the launch of their sort of revamped AI strategy, they've said that they're going to be either using Apple devices to process this AI compute, or private cloud compute, which is sort of an internal AI service. But there's been discussions with Google to move that onto Google Cloud, which is be a just increased reliance on an external partner for a very important future product for Apple, and that's it's interesting.
So when I see the notification on my phone that says, my iPhone is relaying with private cloud compute or something like that. I mean, I remember when Apple unveiled Apple Intelligence. This was the whole thing. Was that it's staying within the Apple umbrella essentially. And what your reporting shows is that there have been talks to perhaps uh, get Google into that mix, and so it wouldn't actually be the private compute, I guess, that we initially thought it might be.
Yes, but I think with Google, the talks are around how to privately deliver this in Google Cloud. So
Right, right. It stays private,
isolating.
just not within Apple. Totally.
Yes, 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 exactly.
Okay. Are there any privacy risks here to bringing in a second player?
I think there's always going to be some risk with the public cloud. I mean, how you configure authentication keys, where you store that. I think there's always going to be risks. Knowing Apple, they're going to have a pretty special sweet deal with Google to make sure that they are kind of um more secure than probably others. So I think, Google's a good partner with Apple, and Apple's extremely cautious. So I think they'll probably figure out some system that can keep um, privacy and security pretty well intact, even in the public cloud.
So, one of the things that I thought your story did a good job of explaining why this discussion is happening at all,
Yeah.
and I want you to explain that to us. And the line that stuck out to me that I'm hoping you can explain is uh, only 10% of Apple's private cloud compute capacity is in use on average, according to former employees. I don't even understand how that's possible for a company like Apple. How much does that play into this?
Well, I think that reflects just how unpopular Apple's new AI products have been. The whole Apple Intelligence system that they announced in 2024, it's been pretty lackluster. The features and the use is just not great, and I think that reflects kind of the poor use of the product and how poorly received it's been by the public and critics. So I think that's primarily the result of that.
And that's is that the reason why they're looking to Google is because they're just not using the capacity, or what's the core reason here?
Well, there's a few reasons. I mean, so private cloud compute is using the chips they use are M series. So this is their Mac chips inside their own sort of private cloud system. And these chips, they're very good for Mac computers. They're not great for sort of big server AIs like Google's Gemini. It's the latency is going to be bad, and so this whole relationship with Google and like getting Siri onto the next generation of like modern LLMs, it's going to struggle to perform in this cloud system they built. So it's just not super capable right now. And then on top of that, serving it doesn't seem to be that great of an investment with really low usage. So it's certainly leading them down this path towards relying on an external partner like Google.
How about Apple's culture of capital allocation and, how tight-fisted they are in terms of making investments and being very careful about that? I mean, does this relate to that at all?
For sure. I mean, so this company Apple has always really struggled with, big upfront costs. They always want to run lean. And sort of like what we've seen over the past few years with this crazy CapEx spend, with all of the big tech players for building out their data center infrastructure for AI. Apple has not leaned into that even, remotely. I mean, slightly uptick in CapEx, but um, you know, this is not their priority. It's not a strategic priority. They don't see it that way. So over the past few years, they've really leaned more into public cloud. And for the finance department at Apple, that's really they view it as a way of controlling costs, keeping it down, and just avoiding that massive upfront spend you'd get with data centers.
So how do you think this inevitably plays out here? Do you think they will end up relying on Google or, even if not Google, I mean, do you think there will be more reliance on outside partners to help build out these capabilities?
Um, Apple has always been a company that has tried to control the essential ingredients of its products. And as it's shown with AI, it really is struggling to do that in-house. So they're having to move to Gemini, external partners, and I think that also holds true in the cloud. Both AI and the cloud are sort of linked forever. And so I think, yeah, they are just going to continue to have to rely on outsiders. And for a company that's obsessed with sort of like controlling their own destiny, I think this is probably arguably, talking to people who've been involved in these efforts, a big blind spot for them.
Very quickly before you go, I know that Apple has a couple special events lined up this week. I know that there's the event on Wednesday that we're all watching for, but they seem to have announced some products today. So just walk us through what you're looking at this week.
Yeah, it's really primarily a device story for this week of products. So today was iPhone 17e. This is their mid-tier, lower price phone that hasn't they've that historically hasn't done that well, but maybe helpful with emerging markets. A new iPad. Potentially most interesting, later this week, they'll be announcing a new MacBook, a lower price MacBook. Obviously, they're very traditionally very expensive devices, but this will be lower priced, so maybe better for the education market, and it'll run on a iPhone chip rather than a Mac chip to help bring down the costs and make it more efficient. So to me, that's probably the most interesting product of this week, but just a device product launch week mostly.
And is there ever a touchscreen MacBook coming at any point? Is that at all in the roadmap? I mean, I've
You want
sort of
that?
been confused. Like, yeah, I've been waiting for it.
I think that's I believe that will be arriving. That will be coming too. If you're interested in that, you'll have an option.
Yeah, well, I mean, that would totally cannibalize the iPad, so I guess maybe they're not rushing to it. So,
There you go.
well, Erin, I want to thank you for coming on. That is Erin Tilley, our Apple reporter here at The Information. The data center boom has prompted questions around how the world will keep electricity costs manageable as demand skyrockets for power. One solution that has gotten a lot of traction are extra high voltage power lines. My colleague Ann Davis wrote a deep dive about that accelerating trend this week in our AI infrastructure newsletter. I want to bring her on to tell us more about it. And welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Akash.
Okay, so let's start with the lead of your piece, which I thought was really it's kind of cool actually. The AI boom is catalyzing the build out of some of the biggest, baddest power lines that this country has ever seen. Tell us about these big bad power lines.
Well, Akash, we all know that demand for power is booming in the AI age. And what today's column describes is a huge $75 billion build out by the nation's transmission operators of what is called extra high voltage power lines. And it is happening particularly in markets where we already see gigawatt scale computing campuses starting to rise.
And how much bigger are we talking here? Like, tactically, is this multiples better? Is it fraction? How big are we talking?
Sure. Yeah. The expansions are for lines that can carry 765,000 volts on a line or 765 kilovolts. Um, they can move about 6 times the power of the transmission lines, the biggest ones that most of us are used to seeing. And these lines are so powerful that they buzz and crackle just in steady state. And you can even make fluorescent light bulbs glow by standing in their electromagnetic field.
Hmm. How do they achieve it? Is it just sticking the power lines together type of thing, or is there some
Well,
new science here?
sure, they're bigger and bundled conductor wires that are much more robust. Um, you use much more powerful versions of the grid equipment, like the very critical transformers that step power down onto lower voltages, or they can go up to. And the towers are much taller to keep away from hazards on the ground, and the protections that they need are also greater to prevent risks like flashovers, which are voltage outbursts that can be as hot as the surface of the sun and can electrocute a
Right.
work. So everything about it is bigger and better.
Now, you had some exclusive reporting about who is working on these lines and also geographically where all this is happening. What did you find?
Yeah, absolutely. So there have been several big announcements by grid operators in the Mid-Atlantic to expand these lines through places where they had started back in the 60s. So Ohio and some uh, places around there. Texas is going through a big expansion that's been announced. And then so are some Mid-Atlantic grid operators that are going to be pushing these 765 kV lines in from like South Dakota to the Great Lakes and down into Oklahoma and New Mexico. But what we report today is that the transmission operator, the giant in transmission, AEP, has just proposed to the grid operator in Texas, known as ERCOT, a new additional third extra high voltage network that would, if went forward, would be a big beltway in northern Texas in the Panhandle area, specifically developed with AI developers to string multi-data gigawatts around the grid.
And what is the significance of this facility? And what does it tell you about the AI build out broadly?
Well, we're going to be getting a much more powerful grid as a result of the AI build out. The presence of wealthy companies that want and need power, where this is their biggest hurdle, means that the grid operators feel more comfortable knowing that if they build these transmission lines, there will be buyers on the other end who are willing to commit for long periods. And so this could ultimately be very good for the industrial expansion in this country. Once we build these are like interstate highways, and imagine what that has enabled in this country.
Hmm. Can I ask you? You visited some of these facilities.
I have.
So what? I mean, just take us inside some of these facilities. What surprised you about it?
Yeah, so I have visited a facility. There are two Asian companies that have very large presences in the U.S. in high voltage equipment. One is Hyosung Haiko, it's a South Korean company, and the other is Hitachi Energy, a bigger household name. Um, I've been to a transformer factory in Memphis for Haiko, and recently visited a high voltage switchgear factory for Hitachi in Pittsburgh. And one thing that is critical about these expensive facilities, they have to build this equipment in clean rooms that have special pressurized rooms that keep dust on the floor. If dust gets into some of these pieces of equipment, it could blow them up. And they have cavernous rooms to test really dangerous pulses of electricity going through this equipment. So it's not just every day that you build these, and there are expansions under way all across the country. GE Vernova and Siemens are also big in this category. They tell me, uh, the head of Hyper North America told me, we can't even keep up. Like, we are building this, $100 million expansions of our factories, but we can't take all the demand. It's crazy out there.
You left us with a bit of a cliffhanger at the end of your column, which is that you spent the whole newsletter talking about extra high voltage power lines. And then at the very end, you said, but just wait, there is also another class of power lines called ultra high voltage. Is that right?
Ultra high voltage.
Ultra high
That's right.
voltage. So who's working on the ultra high voltage? Where's that story at?
So we say to watch China, and while Well, the United States is building out other types of high voltage lines that can go hundreds of miles. Those are called HVDC lines that can cross big regions. China is already quite a bit ahead of us and has built ultra high voltage lines that can carry 1,100 kilovolts. That's 1 million volts. Their lines already are going thousands of miles and are some of the most impressive pieces of grid architecture we've ever seen. So, my very last line in the column is "We better hurry."
Great. Well, Ann, I want to thank you for coming on. That is Ann Davis Vaughan, our AI infrastructure columnist here at The Information. That does it for today's show. A reminder, we are on this stream Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. I want to thank you all for tuning in. We really do appreciate your viewership. Make sure to subscribe to The Information on YouTube and follow us on X, Instagram, TikTok, and check us out wherever you get your podcasts. I am already excited for our next show tomorrow. Have a great rest of your Monday. Bye-bye for now.